First of all, for those of you being with us this year already, thank you so much. My name is Brett McAllister. I am the Director for Graduate Admissions here for Halmos College of Arts and Sciences. Along with me from my staff this evening is Ms. Dee-Fei Lee. She's one of my assistant directors for recruitment with us. And we have the very good pleasure of having Ms. Courtney Rosenthal with us this evening to do our guest lecture series tonight. She will do a little more explaining about what exactly she's going to be talking to you tonight as well, but I do want to make sure that I introduce her as well as I can. So for those of you who do not already know Courtney, Courtney is a master's student in composition, rhetoric, and digital media here at Nova Southeastern University. She works at NSU's Writing and Communication Center as a graduate assistant coordinator. Her research is theory-centric with a focus on digital environments, spatiality, and non-human agencies in writing studies. So Courtney, once again, thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited to listen to all you have to talk about. And with that, Courtney, the floor is yours. Can't wait.
Thank you for the lovely introduction. Let me pull up my PowerPoint for today. All right. Can you see that okay?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. All right. So hello, my name is Courtney Rosenthal. I am currently pursuing a master's degree in composition, rhetoric, and digital media here at Nova Southeastern University. I greatly enjoy all there is to learn about theory in English, composition, and rhetorical studies, and it has been the center of my scholarship since I was an undergraduate here. At the moment, I am focusing on digital environments, spatiality, and non-human agencies in the scope of writing studies, and I'm greatly inspired by a lot of the recent scholarship covering this topic. So today, I'm here to talk about OO, which is better known as object-oriented ontology. And it's a loaded term in itself, so I'm going to break it down just a little. Ontology is the philosophical study of existence. Object-oriented ontology, or OO for short, because of the 3 O's, puts things or objects at the center of this study. So it's the philosophical study of existence of objects. I happen to like calling it OO because it sounds funny, and I think object-oriented ontology is a mouthful. But OO has a complicated history in relation to the metaphysical and philosophical theories that came before it, especially Kantian theory. And I'm hoping that in applying its concepts to minimalism, which is a lifestyle many of us are familiar with, it will help unpack the theory and enlighten us to the ways that it proves useful and interesting. All right, so the title of my lecture frames minimalism as a spectacle due to its prominence in pop culture at the given moment. Television shows such as Marie Kondo's Tidying Up soared in popularity at the height of the pandemic, likely because people were inside of their homes and forced to face the objects surrounding them. In contrast, we see reality TV shows like Hoarders depicting a harsh visualization of what occurs when objects truly consume us or are entirely surrounding us. With its origins residing in art, linguistics, and architecture, minimalism is all about the reduction and elimination of things that the beholder or the human perceives as unnecessary or even useless. It's simply a simplification of the surrounding environment. And I think we've all come across the term minimalism in one way or another, and the images I presented here show it in these various forms. And I've even designed my presentation with a minimalist ideology in mind, given that it's quite barren and only contains the bare necessities. The minimalist movement, in an attempt to summarize the large scope it encompasses in its many fields and practices, is founded on embracing, quote, white space, less as more, the power of decluttering, and with the power of decluttering, you're decluttering your space and thus your mind. So this space can be either physical or abstract, though honing in on the lifestyle movement prioritizes the physical and the physicality of objects. Minimalism then can be defined as the valuation of fewer possessions, which gives weight in terms of value to the object, which is what object-oriented ontology would assert. And we'll talk a bit more about this later. So the application of lifestyle minimalism typically involves reducing the number of objects one owns. You could practice minimalism by throwing out meaningless objects, abstaining from buying things, sticking to the essentials, or only investing in quality objects that supplement your lifestyle. The minimalists are two men who have spearheaded more modern discussions on minimalism, and they find that that minimalism spans beyond just the surface level. It is, quote, a tool that can assist you in finding freedom. Today's problems seem to be the meaning we assign to stuff. We assign too much meaning to things. When you shed these objects, minimalists contend that you find a freedom or a clarity that helps you prioritize the more important things in life, which they see as experiences or human relationships. This argument for simplicity, according to some minimalists, is born out of the complexities and social expectations of the United States and other industrialized countries, and is, quote, exactly why minimalism is needed. Minimalism then can be examined as a direct response to how one is pushed into the role of the consumer in Western cultures. So what does this mean in relation to the strange phrase in my title, object-oriented ontology? Well, look around you. You are surrounded by objects. The computer in front of you, the desk you're sitting at, or even your chair, or the couch or bed that you're on right now. Objects exist all around us, yet we often perceive them as background or supplementary to our human existence. Active human subjects are understood to confront, possess, and interact with passive objects that only become active when we come into contact with them. This thought is ultimately anthropocentric, which centers the human perspective and reduces all other beings, whether living or non-living, to merely a means to human ends. Put simply, it puts humans at the top of the hierarchy, often proclaiming that we are the most important and powerful beings in that we have the ability to self-actualize or have a consciousness. Many scholars have pointed to anthropomorphic thought as the root of ecological crises, given that in centering the human, we ultimately decenter surrounding systems and things that uphold the very ecosystem that not only we depend on, but that other living entities depend on. This gave rise, of course, to ecocentrism, which considers the entirety of the ecosystem, bestowing all living entities, and that living part is important, as it will come back later when we look at object-oriented ontology, with inherent equal value. One could argue that minimalism is inherently anthropocentric, as it gives humans the power to shed objects and values focus on other things that supplement their lives. Although what many minimalists don't really acknowledge is the unique complexities of objects in their relation to us. So, what I ask of you today is to expand your mind a little. Think of things vibrantly. When I speak to the vibrancy of things, I conjure up Jane Bennett's use of this word. Things or objects have a capacity, not only at the whims of human design, but also as a force or tendency of their own accord. Yes, I'm saying that the chair that you sit in has agency in a similar or even the same way that you have agency. Though seemingly inanimate, it is lively and vibrant in its materiality. Material powers can, as Bennett puts it, quote, aid or destroy, enrich or disable, ennoble or degrade us. Fascinatingly, these expressions do not require any consciousness or self-awareness on behalf of the object. Instead, the object resides completely unaware of its power. Before I move on to breaking down object-oriented ontology further, I wanted to emphasize that I do not subscribe to this theory in its entirety. Graham Harman was the one who devised this theory, and he was dead set on carving out a space to talk about the autonomous existence of objects. And in fact, I think Graham Harman would likely not exactly approve of my application of it. But I think that with the supplement of other theories, as well as maybe my own perspective, we can better understand the role of objects better, especially in pertaining to minimalists and how they intend to shed these objects. All right, so we are undoubtedly all interconnected. And I'm not just referencing the digital age. Even before smartphones became normal, we lived interconnectedly, requiring other things and systems to survive. Humans and non-humans coalesce, a part of a bigger network, assemblage, ecology, whatever you may term this relational whole that we're all a part of. We move within the world in relation to one another and in relation to things, systems, qualities, ecosystems. My favorite example to describe this relationality through is that of a river. A river is an unconscious object, and it still has the capacity to express something through the ecosystem in which it inhabits. The river is comprised of water molecules, shaping the very terrain around its flow, moving and aggregating animals that drink from it, and it is fed by surrounding lakes and springs. Perhaps humans even come to this river to swim. Maybe it comes into contact with us by way of drinking from the springs that it is fed by. It is an object made of objects, further moving surrounding objects. And this is just merely one assemblage in the larger scope of assemblages. I have here two of these assemblages, which depicts the interconnectedness of things. The one on the left is a little less complex. It's just depicting the relationship between a student, their university, and all the things in between that are related to one another. And then the one on the right is a bit more highly complex, but much more accurate as far as these assemblages look in actuality. It's examining the network of farming enterprises and their relationality to things like local infrastructure, legislation, consumers, managers. It's assemblages that are relational all the way down, which is termed infinite regression. There is no center or prototype that these assemblages are made of. One could argue that the atom is the base structure in that everything in the universe is essentially made up of atoms. Although atoms themselves are an assemblage in that they are made up of particles, protons, neutrons, electrons that in turn are relational and spark further relationality among things. Though now I'm going to tell you something really startling. You are an object. There is no separation between human or non-human. Much like ecocentrism bestows all living things with equality, no entity is granted more privilege than the other, even the non-human. Everything is an object. If we shift our role to that of an object among objects, rather than merely a human who has possession over these objects, as minimalists proclaim, we better understand our own objectness and what it means to be an object. Put simply, things are not only real in as much as we, the human, perceives them to be real, or as we imbue them with qualities. Objects are things within the world. We are also things within the world. Therefore, we have the capacity to move and be moved by other objects that surround us. Further complicating things, let us introduce Harman's quadruple object. So I'm going to attempt to simplify this because it can get very complex very quickly, especially if you consider all 10 linkages. And I think if we were to do so, we would be here for hours, and I don't think that's really what anyone wants to do. So objects have two categories, sensual objects and real objects, and two possible qualities, sensual qualities and real qualities. Sensual objects are abstract as they don't really have to exist in physicality. They exist within the mind, a perception of the object by which you understand the object through whatever access you are granted in the world. They carry sensual qualities that we can understand through our perception or experience with the object. Real objects exist physically, although we only have access to these objects through their sensuality, aka our perception of the object, what our senses tell us about it. We can never know the object as it truly really is. We cannot know their real qualities. We are not granted access to this realness. I think of it as akin to a sort of objectiveness. How could we ever know an object as it truly is apart from our experiences and perception of it? Let us extrapolate on this through the example of a chair. It is sensual in that if I get up and walk to the other room, I know it is still there. It is still a chair in my mind. It has metal armrests, a slightly curved back. It's meant for me to sit on. It's made of leather. And these are the sensual qualities that I understand the chair through, although it is not the real object in itself. I imagine your experience with this same chair would be quite different than mine. Perhaps you find it uncomfortable or you rather stand. Now think about a cat's same experience with a chair. I highly doubt my cat Cricket would have the same sensual understanding of the chair or even perceive it in the same way that I do. And we can go even further in looking at how an ant would perceive this chair, or even a piece of dirt would perceive a chair. Thus, an object cannot be real or truly known by us. It can only be known through another object, whether that object be human or non-human. My chair oftentimes finds itself tucked into a desk. Thus, there is a relation established between the chair and the desk. The chair and the desk are sensual objects to one another. They don't know each other as real objects either. We can't, of course, tap into any consciousness the desk may or may not hold, or how it sensually perceives the chair, but the relation between the two is still solidly established, and not just in the human mind. I think it's a bit easier now to digest how objects hold an agency, especially in knowing that we too are objects. I think the word efficacy is a good way to describe this expression of agency, being that these objects oftentimes exude a power that produces desired or intended results in their sensual projections. These relations are what allow the agency to be exuded, which does connect us back to minimalist main assertion that we assign meaning to things. Well, they contend that we assign too much meaning to things, but at the heart of it, yes, we do assign meaning to things through the sensual qualities by which we perceive the object. So, another thing tied to minimalism is anti-consumerism. And it is we undoubtedly live in a consumerist culture in which objects have become commodified. That is, objects have been given a value that is pushed to us through a monetary transaction. We often come across advertisements entitled 10 reasons you need this juice processor, or this hairbrush will change your life. Advertisers use the sensual object to their advantage, although instead of this sensuality arising from our own personal experience with the object and perception of the object, we are informed by an outside source that essentially looks to inscribe this object with a value, further obscuring the actual sensuality it transmits to us in having it before us. Sensuality is already removed from physicality. This only removes it further. Thus, the real object is even more unknown to us, which I argue makes it easier for consumerism to thrive on the level that it has. And a lot of consumerism is fueled by the thought that in possessing a given object, it will transmute certain qualities to others, which goes to show how much the object does exude an agency and carry okay, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that word. But this is especially true in the flashy branding that we see embellished in our clothing items. I think this is pretty concrete proof that these sensual objects have an effect over us, and the commodification of the sensual qualities has proved itself to be very profitable. What minimalists and anti-consumerists do is attempt to push back against the power of the object's given sensuality. At least that is what I'm arguing. Many have attempted to devalue its capabilities, seizing back their own conceived power over it. Although we cannot shed this sensuality entirely, for it is the only way we have access to the object. But minimalism allows us to perhaps have or develop a keen awareness of how this sensuality becomes exploited by consumerist cultures. Developing this awareness allows us to think a bit more critically about why an object may be advertised or portrayed to us in a certain way. I think perhaps minimalism teaches people to have a more refined understanding of this sensuality. In its practice, to whatever degree of extremity you follow, you are asked to look at your objects and then ask yourself, does this spark pleasure? Well, that's what Marie Kondo would say, but it ultimately boils down to, how does this object impact or alter my life? Which then asks of you to analyze your relations. Does that pen really add value to your life? How do you use it? When do you use it? Do you use it at school? Do you use it at work? Will maybe a friend need a pen one day? Or do you already have a million pens already? A great quote, I think, to solidify this is by none other than the minimalist, as they proclaim themselves. They state that minimalists don't avoid material possessions. We avoid excess. Paradoxically, by owning less, the things that we own bring greater joy to our lives. Minimalism then can be seen as a reduction of the assemblages within our lives. By effectively choosing to rid yourself of an object, you move your relation to it in a sense, which does allow you to shift your focus to assemblages that you feel add to your quality of life. Some assemblages, though, are not at all escapable, which is quite inevitable in an industrialized country, and even just inevitable in being a part of this world in any capacity. Even if you were to move to the woods, completely cut off from all human means of production, you would still be a part of assemblages. Although you would be much more aware of how these assemblages impacted you, your role within these assemblages, and what objects held agency or power. I especially like this quote by Thoreau, not only because it appeals to my literary inclinations, but because of his emphasis on living deliberately, as that is what I see as the main goal of minimalist, to have more careful consideration over the ways in which objects, including oneself, carry a power. I will end this lecture in saying that minimalism is inherently anthropocentric. It is indeed a human practice and positions humans as the sole holder of power in assemblages to some degree, as they're able to cut out assemblages in their life. Though it also asks people to think a little deeper and develop that keen awareness about the sensuality that objects transmute to us and the assemblages that they are ultimately a part of. While my lecture today is not meant to advocate for the lifestyle in any capacity, I wanted to analyze the ways in which it connects to object-oriented ontology and perhaps even fleshes out this complicated theory. I know that perhaps this has been a little different than a standard lecture, especially for those of you who are more familiar with science-based lectures, but I wanted to take the chance to say that theory is a wonderful thing in any capacity. It helps establish the many fields that encompass social sciences and the humanities, and it provides critical examinations of society, culture, power structures, and the world at large. So thank you for listening to me today. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them, because I know the mere concept of me saying that you are an object or an object carries agency in the same way that you do is a bit confusing or may not make complete sense. And I know that this theory has been criticized by a lot of major philosophical movements, so I invite criticism just as well. But thank you for attending again.
Awesome, Courtney. Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating to listen to, and I do think it's kind of interesting that more of us might honestly think we're doing that than we realize. That's kind of. I know we do have a question already in. So I saw that it come earlier. So from Juliet Kitchen. So I'll start the Q&A session by just start reading off questions to you, Courtney. For those of you that are listening in, please, if you have questions, type them in the chat, and I'll be happy to moderate and read them off. So first question: what role or roles, if any, do embodied experiences play in object-oriented ontology? If all things are equally objects, what is the value of embodied experiences?
So yes, I believe embodiment truly does play a role in object-oriented ontology, and that object-oriented ontology scholars don't value these embodied experiences any less. They just put them on equal grounds with other relations. Object-oriented ontology just reflects the notion that things can only be understood in how they, just rejects the notion that things can only be understood in how they appear to us. So a lot of object-oriented thinkers don't want to ignore the embodied experiences of humans at all, as they themselves are humans and trying to flesh out the impact of objects on us and other objects. I think I'd argue that object-oriented ontological thinkers wish to complicate the notion and our understanding of embodiment by opening up the subjectivity of the human to other influences. Jane Bennett, which thank you for introducing me to her, Dr. Kitchens, does a lot of work in this field to essentially showcase this.
So great talk. The idea that minimalism is anthropocentric seems to contradict the heart of OO, which would seem to argue that a minimalist can only call themselves a minimalist when the network of objects grant them the experience of being a minimalist. Kind of like how an author is born only once the text births them. Can you expand on this?
So I think at the heart of object-oriented ontology, it's just a rejection of Kant's Copernican revolution, which essentially focused on objects as they appear to humans. Thus, they would grant so to exist is to be perceived, is what Kant would argue, whereas object-oriented ontologists want to argue that you exist apart from being perceived. And it does essentially contradict the heart of OO, but I think that minimalism it's a cool way to conceptualize how OO may affect us. And I think that's all I can give as far as an answer to that question.
That works for me. Another question we do have is, does OO have a way to describe or characterize the types of relationships between objects in an assemblage?
I think Harman does go a little bit more into depth about what these like network of assemblages look like, but I know that more in-depth theories lie in system, like looking at the broader system and how networks look. So I think that a lot of these answers are found in, I suppose, other theories, but I still think that these other theories carry a great deal of object-oriented ontological thought, just that they don't really recognize or acknowledge it to any degree. And I think like theories including like new materialism, the more in-depth look at system theories, as well as ecological theory to some degree, applies the concepts of OO, but really kind of doesn't recognize that they're doing so.
We do have a follow-up question to the previous difficult one. So if we can only perceive things through our own senses and experiences, then how can we be sure that objects have agency and that OO is not just a projection of something we'd like it to perceive?
So I think we've all come across the phrase, if a tree falls in a forest and there's no one around to hear it, does it make a sound? And the answer to this question actually varies by a lot of people. Some, I think the object-oriented ontologists would argue that the tree's fall still produces vibrations within the air surrounding it, and it consequently has an impact on the surrounding environment in some capacity. So even if it's devoid of our perception of it. More anthropocentric answers to this riddle would essentially claim that the sound is merely the transmission of vibrations to our senses. So with no one around to sense or perceive it, the falling tree does not make a sound. So that goes back to the whole concept that to exist is to be perceived. But OO just rejects the claim that human experience rests at the center of philosophy and can only be understood in how they appear to us. I think the tree falling is a good riddle because essentially there's still impact devoid of our recognition of it. And we can see this especially in eco-critical thought, where ecosystems will function with or without human perception of it.
Awesome. I do have another question for you. So hypothetically, we set a goal to move closer to minimalism. How would you define the role of human agency in attaining the goal? Is it kind of the prime antithesis to reaching the goal, or maybe is it the primary access point to reach the goal?
So I think it's certainly an access point, and it does go back to the fact that ecosystems will continue to move and function beyond the human, but it's still useful to see how maybe the human interacts within these systems and networks, and how our impact can have a detrimental or positive net in the overall system as a whole. So I think it's more so the primary access point in towards moving towards minimalist thought, and perhaps having a more ecological or object-oriented view of things that will perhaps remove us from our anthropocentrism and help us better the ecology as a whole.
Awesome. Thank you, Courtney. I actually do have a question myself as you were talking. I couldn't help myself. I will get to that question in just a moment. So you mentioned before, the valuation of fewer possessions. How often do people do this without, or how often do you think people do this without knowing they're doing it? And or is it almost always like a conscious thought to value things in that way?
I certainly think that people can do so without really realizing that they value those fewer possessions, especially people who do go out into the woods and live alone. I think they find value in human relationships and experiences in which they don't even realize anymore that they need objects to supplement their life in some way. And if they do, they have a more refined understanding of how these objects impact them. But I think as a whole, we are either aware or unaware of our relation to objects, but being completely unaware is where things can become dangerous.
Okay, we got a couple long questions here, so give me just a moment. All right, so we have from Logan. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us, Courtney. It seems to me like understanding the agency, sensuality, materiality of objects can help us cultivate a richer, more nuanced understanding of the writing composition process, especially in terms of our embodied relationships with the things with which we write and compose. This might be outside the scope of your work, so this question is just a thought experiment. Do you see any way to bring ooh into the writing classroom, and how valuable might this theory be for students? What does it mean to teach writing composition process in which the student writer is decentered?
Oof, that's a good one. And I think that's where a lot of writing studies scholarship is moving in the direction, is looking at those non-human agencies. And especially with the rise of ChatGPT and other non-human algorithms that have been seen to have an effect, and they've become a spectacle in of themselves. But I think that it can be useful to decenter the human, but it also can be dangerous. There's certainly a ground that we need to strike, especially in the scope of writing, a common ground that we need to strike in the scope of writing studies. But I've seen a lot of work published on the writing environments and the environments you write in, which is anthropocentric to some degree as well. But I think it's useful to see how our writing environments may shape us as writers, or may shape how people perceive us as writers. So I think object-oriented ontology certainly carries traces in a lot of scholarship that writing studies has to deal with, except that most people don't acknowledge that what they're doing is object-oriented thinking.
Awesome. I found your approach to minimalism as perhaps running away from sensuality, particularly the propagandized sensuality of consumerism, interesting. This perspective maybe seems to combat those like Susan Sontag, who argues that minimalism art is art that is running away from modern intellectualizing towards sensuality. i.e. an erotics of art, embodied aesthetics, but perhaps these views are ultimately consonant.
So of course I know Susan Sontag, but I don't think I've read that particular work of hers, but I definitely need to, especially if it addresses minimalism, because that's completely up my alley. But I think that I need to look at that text more so before I would be able to answer that.
Totally fair. And she did put in the tag, so it's Beyond Interpretation by Susan Sontag for
Beautiful.
your future. I can always send it to you after. She'd also ask, does language count as an object?
Interesting. I would argue yes. And I think Harman would agree that Harman essentially says that everything is an object, even qualities to some extent, even objects that we may not perceive to be real. Like Harman has a whole section where he introduces the fact that Harry Potter is an object, even though he's not a real person at all, but we still have the power to perceive him as an object through our sensuality. But I think that perhaps language is an object, and it also helps us better understand objects and our relationality to things. So honestly, I see language more as a quality because I don't entirely subscribe to Harman's theory fully. I lean more on the living matter and Jane Bennett's side of or vibrant matter. I'm sorry, I always misquote that. But yeah, I think it can definitely be perceived as an object, especially if we're perceived as an object.
One of our listeners did ask, could you please elaborate a bit further on humans' objectiveness relative to objects' objectiveness?
So I think what you're asking is how we all exist as objects, or if there's any difference in humans' objectness as opposed to objects' objectness. And Harman and me as well would argue that there's no difference, despite the fact that we have a sort of consciousness. We're still not fully tapped into what consciousness another object may or may not hold. Therefore, it would be anthropocentric to say that we are a different type of object, because we still can't get to the heart of the qualities, the real qualities that other objects hold. We can only know them through relations with one another.
Awesome. We do have time for a few more questions, and I think we've given Courtney enough of putting her through the ringer with some of these. They've been fantastic. Thank you for writing in, everybody. So for the writing center question, would U argue that language is speaking, which is something that post-structuralists like Barths argue no? Does this matter when we're thinking about writing practices? Perhaps cheekily, like Fawcett says, what matters, who's speaking?
I think U would argue that us merely speaking is to sensually transmit our relation to objects and things. And I'm actually curious to look at some texts that look at language through the scope of object-oriented ontology, because I find it fascinating just as well. And I've actually never heard of that Foucault quote, but I know Foucault always says things cheekily. So that's all I have for that question.
Sounds good. We have another one. A very interesting presentation, so thank you for sharing it. Scholars like Ray Terada argue that the experience of emotion is actually an argument against subjectivity. In other words, while most people think of emotions as something personal that identifies us as human subjects, when we are seized by an emotion, we're being treated as an object by an outside force. How do object-oriented ontologists think about the experience of or value of emotion?
I think object-oriented ontologists would somehow look towards emotion through the realm of sensual qualities and emotion as a byproduct of these sensual qualities. So emotion is a huge part in our consciousness and how we relate to one another. So I think there's also fruitful explorations in looking at how emotions may be relational and help us connect to things in a relational way. So I actually think that would make for an interesting paper.
I think we have time for one more question, I guess. And I think if there are those of you who have more questions later, please feel free to email anybody on my staff, and we will pass it along to Courtney. So we have one more question. So, excuse me. Would you mind sharing with us a bit about what inspires your interest in this topical area? And I think that's a good one to end on. It's more about Courtney herself, which is always fantastic.
Well, a great friend of mine jokes that the reason why I look at objects is because I don't like humans all that much. But I think that may be true to some degree, but I just find that there's a dearth of scholarship in covering objects, and a lot of scholarship can be anthropocentric, and I think those are fruitful and well-established fields, but especially, as I mentioned before, the rise of non-human actors like ChatGPT or any algorithm-based programming system, there's just a sort of gap that needs to be filled in looking at these agencies, especially in pertaining to digital environments. And for some reason, I've just been enthralled by that gap and have been looking for ways to fill it with my own scholarship and thoughts on the process. But I think that's what it really boils down to.
Awesome. Well, those of you who are here with us this evening, thank you so much for being here. I think we will wrap it up enough with that. I think Courtney needs to take a break after all those fantastic questions. So thank you for those of you who were here with us this evening. This has been one of my personal favorite virtual lectures that we're hosting here at NSU. We will do more in the future. So please feel free to keep a lookout for your emails, anything out through our social media. Courtney, thank you so much for being here. It was absolutely fantastic listening to you. And I guess that wraps us up this evening. So once again, thank you for being here. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend coming up. And yeah, look forward to hopefully you guys all finding a home here at NSU. Take care, guys, and have a great night.